It's Friday, Feedback Friday, the feedbackiest day of the week. It's Feedback Friday, and I got through that. Some of you longtime watchers may know that this is one of the 2 times of year that I get allergy cough, and it's been bad lately. So I'm going to try to rest my voice because I find that talking makes it bad. But it's Feedback Friday, so here I am. And I was planning on focusing on the Facebook thing, but there was a surprising amount of agreement on the fact that something needs to be done about social media and that government intervention, proper, moderate, minimal government intervention is required, which really surprises me, I guess in a good way, with this community. This community tends to be very free speech oriented. And so when this community is saying something got to be done, that says something. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, help support this channel. Become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K. I will not be commenting on the Twitch stuff right now. Maybe next week when I've processed it later. But yeah, I was really surprised that the general consensus is that a lot of people are like me and don't use Facebook a lot. But also that the general consensus is that something needs to be done about this ever-changing algorithm thing. There's a distrust of politicians, and yet there seems to be a greater distrust of these social media companies that, as more than one commenter pointed out, we're at the point where these companies are not public utilities or common carriers, but they're acting like them. The one comment that really made me sit up and take notice is that this is how politicians are communicating with potential voters. And so you've got a right to franchise exercise issue here. Basically, quote, like it or not, the internet is the public square on the public marketplace now. And that makes me a little bit worried personally. We'll get to this when I touch on a Wellness Wednesday comment as well. The internet is not a substitute for face-to-face conversation and being out with your fellow humans. I say this as a profound introvert that isn't big on being out with fellow humans. But we're in this weird place that because of a series of government failures, especially in the US, the internet is the public space, and private companies have an amount and a type of power and responsibility that was never intended to be held by private companies. Now, as you know, the same commenter I quoted before said, Verizon is a private company, UPS is a private company. We don't let them disconnect your call if they don't like what you're saying, or confiscate your package if they disagree with what you shipped. Yes, that's the issue. We have the other side. Yes, Momo is chiming in. We have the other side where the government is allowed to monitor your phone calls with a warrant and is allowed to intercept and even open suspicious packages in certain areas, like going across the border. So we have to balance this right to privacy with right to access, and we are in uncharted territory. I know I keep going back to this, but the internet is the biggest communication innovation since the movable type printing press. And if I can do an aside for a moment, I remember when I learned about the movable type printing press in high school. I had I'm learning more and more. I had an utterly glorious and very special high school education. Yes, Momo. Um, but I remember I had a wonderful, wonderful English teacher. Took multiple years with him. His name was Mr. Connor. Shout out if he's still around. Um, but he taught us, and then my history teacher, Mr. Martinello, who's no longer with us, taught us about movable type printing presses and how much they changed the world and how much scurrious slander came in the early days, but how much it changed not just how people communicate, but how people understood the world. Um, it is impossible to summarize quickly how much these huge leaps forward in communication change things, and how adapting to these new realities takes time. And propaganda becomes widespread, defamation becomes widespread until we figure out how to deal with this new normal. And I'm not saying this to invalidate anyone's concerns, quite the opposite. I'm saying this to let people be okay to be unnerved by this. Like, yes, it's unnerving. It's a big change. It's uncharted territory. This is why when people say, we want innovation, well, the unknown is part of innovation. And if you're not prepared to take one with the other, you don't really want innovation because you don't want the unknown. The challenge is going to be, we are in a situation right now where the people who have been deliberately divided by both politics and social media have to serve as a check, a watchdog on both this particular subset of private corporation that has become incredibly powerful, and the government, which we don't have proper separation between the two. It's almost like, I hate to say this because it's quite, some people will take it as quite sensational, but it's almost like we're in the Winston Tunnel scene in Atlas Shrugged. Yes, I just referenced Ayn Rand, but the issue with that scene is that they showed how each person on that train who was allegedly an innocent was actually giving up power to the state and corrupt corporations, not to, some people won't like me saying this, but the good kind of capitalism, people who actually want to do fair things with their companies and with their work. And it's a bit of a character study in either just moral laziness or noble cause corruption. And we live in an age of noble cause corruption. We live in an age where too many people believe that the ends justify the means. And the internet didn't create that. Obviously not. The internet did not exist when Ayn Rand wrote the Winston Tunnel scene. But we are facing this, that, a lot of people, as all this internet weirdness, like, the Twitch hack, they're like, Twitch is corrupt and bad. And I think, that's Dagny Taggart and company and so on and so forth. But John Galt blowing up that tunnel, but nothing changes every time it happens, right? And I think that's the challenge we have here, is that we've done the Age of Hacktivism. It didn't change much. It actually just consolidated power. And Mr. Robot was very smart in that regard, that, you know, these companies, when they do things like that, the public doesn't V for Vendetta it. They don't rise up and, you know, actually it's V for Vendetta the comic, not V for Vendetta the movie. The public doesn't rise up in lockstep. Things descend into chaos because people are afraid, and it becomes very dog eat dog and everybody fights each other. Alan Moore is controversial. Alan Moore is a little bit eccentric. Alan Moore is very smart, very wise, and he is not wrong in the themes he writes about. There has to be a way to moderate criminal behavior online. We can't, that's a good thing, right? We need rules. The thing about law, well-written law, is people can understand it, right? Most people understand what is illegal and is not illegal, and except in, you know, places like tax law, where that's why you have to trust your accountant. And sometimes you can't. I have friends that couldn't trust their accountant. That sucked. But, you know, the internet will, as one commenter said, collapse under the weight of bot-driven spam and harassment unless certain sane rules, certain reasonable rules are created. It's that reasonable part that a lot of people, myself included, are very, very skeptical the government can manage. There was a law that made it to the Canadian Senate. Yes, we have one. It's not like the U.S. Senate. It's appointments. And the whole idea of the Senate is to pump the brakes on partisan politicking and correct glaring errors in certain bills before they get royal assent. We call, you know, that's the equivalent of the president signing the bill in the US. And then, you know, Supreme Court challenges. Our assisted dying bill got struck down by the Canadian Supreme Court. There was a Communications Reform Act that died in the Senate because of the latest election. And it was, in part, it was controversial because certain people misrepresented what was in the bill, and how our system works in the American media. So a lot of people got all freaked out about it accordingly. But we have readings in Canadian government that it doesn't work the same way in the US. I'll spare you, but there is a corrections process here that usually works. And if it doesn't, it is caught by our Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court is not the partisan mess that the US Supreme Court is. We're fortunate here in Canada that our structure of government and rule of law has essentially held in a way that it seems to be wavering in the US. And trust me, we do not take that for granted up here. At least I and the people in my social circle don't. But the issue with this bill is how you word regulation of these privately held companies that essentially serve as public spaces. The easy part of the telecommunications bill was the idea that, you know, Netflix and Amazon and Disney Plus and all that stuff can't just come into Canada, flood the market with American content, and not obey Canadian rules in terms of media. We have bilingualism requirements up here. I know a lot of people, if you're further west than Ontario, French isn't super useful to you. Ukrainian, Mandarin, and Cantonese are probably more useful for you, but still, you know, everything sort of east of Toronto, French isn't bad. I'm glad I learned French, even though I need about 3 days immersion when I go over to Quebec. But we have rules like that. We have Canadian content regulations, and that was a big part of that bill, is just making sure that Canadian media doesn't get wiped out by the protectionist juggernaut that is America, that we serve as a very large hat to, because the size of our population basically means that there are a lot of, believe it or not, Canadians are taking our gerbs types still existing in the US, and they like to be protectionist. I know quite a few people, they're Canadian actors working and living in the US, and they have to stay constantly employed or they get deported. And you don't stay constantly employed in entertainment. And so they end up taking a lot of jobs they don't really like and aren't really proud of just to maintain that visa. It sucks. So much for free trade, free movement of goods and people, rant over. But the other part of this bill is illegal activity online. And we have hate speech laws in Canada that the US does not have. The US has a very, very broad, laissez-faire concept of free speech. We do have hate crime and hate speech laws and rules in Canada, and we get into this issue with hate speech of definition. How do you define hate speech? The general assumption is that it's when you actually start advocating or saying things that could be reasonably inferred to advocate harm against a group of people based on immutable characteristics. Now, it's that infer part, right? That's where people start getting nervous, because that becomes like, the American pornography test. I'll know it when I see it. And that's the big challenge with creating these bills. You don't want a piece of legislation that clamps down on unpopular ideas. No, really, fellow progressives watching, you don't want that. Because if all that's required is that an idea is considered deviant or immoral, I would have been either, muzzled or arrested when I was advocating for gay marriage, what we called it then, not marriage equality, in the 1990s, because that was unpopular. It was considered sinful. It was considered deviant. People would think of the children arguments. Moral hygiene dictated that we did not speak of these ugly, awful things, and yet we were allowed to. Even though people didn't like it, even though we risked violence, even though some of us had violence perpetrated against us for our views. And the cops looked the other way because the argument was we had provoked the violence with our views. Probably the wrong call by that cop that I dealt with in retrospect, but yeah. And this is difficult because there is a group of professional insiders. There's an entire class of them, both on the left and the right, who've gotten very, very, very good at dog whistle communications and very, very good at not saying the thing that would get them in trouble. But, one thing leads to another and people infer the very thing they wanted inferred by it, but no, they couldn't say. And so we're in a really difficult challenge here it's going to take a bipartisan effort to figure this out and to get laws passed, because as the same commenter said, the right doesn't like the banning, the Silicon Valley censorship. They don't like that Trump was kicked off Twitter, and Facebook and so on and so forth. The left doesn't like the MasterCard's OnlyFans debacle. The problem is the right and the left both think the other side is evil and slimy and, based on individual actors, both can point to people who have behaved immorally or hypocritically. There's a greater first principle at play here, which is a defense of freedom, that both sides, if you are progressive, you need to defend freedom precisely because all of our ideas start off as horrendously unpopular and gain strength over time. My God, was it exhausting and not fun to be the only person in a room full of 15 people saying, no, somebody didn't become a woman, someone was born a woman, was assigned male at birth. These ideas are gaining traction. We're not there yet, but holy hell, was that not fun and isolating. And I lost a lot of opportunities because I believed in those things and advocated and was the person in the room who stood up and was counted early. You can hear me getting emotional because a lot of bad memories with that stuff. But that view gained traction over time. Now it's bordering on mainstream. But that is not where it started. So we can't ban scary or unpopular ideas, and we cannot ban challenges or questioning to the views that we agree with. If only there could have been some open debate on the whole thing when I first started advocating that stuff professionally, instead of just shutting me down and telling me to shut up and go away. That's what we don't want. Right? And I don't want that for people who disagree with me on this stuff or anything. I want a fair engagement with the ideas and with the data, with the only two outcomes that anybody is truly concerned about being justice and truth. Right? And truth must be based on facts. We're not truthy. We might be able to get something up here, but of course then someone will run to the American media and the American media will have its way with it and people won't trust the bill because it'll recirculate back up here, which is why Canadian personalities run to Fox News regarding Canadian politics, and Fox News engages it in the culture war because they know that it makes the people trying to draft legislation miserable. And are there flaws in some of this legislation? Sure. But they're not the ones that the American media seizes on, because American pundits tend to assume that Canadian politics is structured like U.S. politics, and it's not. And so what happens is that we have trouble being a testing ground for things now, like we were in the 90s when same-sex marriage became legalized. And it was under 50%. When the Chrétien government legalized it, and it was just people managed to persuade enough members of parliament to sign on to that we tried it and the sky didn't fall. And so people eventually, it normalized and we're like, you know what? Nothing bad is really happening. People don't like doing social experiments on a national scale, but in this case, we weren't the first. This internet stuff is different. Nobody's figured it out yet. Europe's trying. I don't think we can afford to wait 5 to 10 years to see whether this European antitrust stuff shakes out. I think we need some sort of legislation. We certainly need America to sort of step up, but I think we're all kind of like, yeah, right? Like, no, the U.S. government, as it isn't gonna really do a good job right now. They can't even pass a regular plain old infrastructure bill right now, never mind the internet. So where does that leave us? Well, this leaves us with something I'm going to pivot to with Wellness Wednesday and talking about, rejection and feeling isolated and feeling out of place and feeling ostracized. And that, I think, is the thing that is really driving people into their bunkers and leading to inaction, and is the reason we can't get more done. People feel incredibly under siege, and people who are under siege fear change. And when people fear change, we can't pass legislation that makes people's lives better, right? And so this one commenter said, how do you cope when an entire community rejects you? Because the Wellness Wednesday video is about rejection. It's hard enough being rejected by one person, but dealing with rejection from a community you feel like you should belong to is exponentially harder, especially if there's really nowhere else that shares that particular interest or provides the support you need. And this comment jumped out at me because I've been there. And the truth is, and please, commenter, hear me out and don't just jump at the first thing I say, because yes, there's some catastrophizing language in this. It is unlikely that every single person in a particular community rejected you personally. It felt like it, and that's totally valid. It's just that usually you run afoul of gatekeepers with too much power in a community, and that's what rejects you. It happened to me in comic books. Long before the Comicsgate thing happened, I will remember fondly the late Darwin Cook for as long as I live. I hear this guy behind me saying, "So, Leanna, I hear your tits are too big for a local regressive lefty comic book convention." I turn around and there's Darwin Cook grinning, like the cat that ate the canary. And I laughed, and it was his way of saying, I think it's bullshit. We all know it's bullshit. Bless him. But that caused real problems for me. And eventually I had to decide that writing comics and working in the comic book industry was not in the cards for various reasons politically. Because of that reality, because certain gatekeepers were just rejecting me for various reasons. Similar with sci-fi fandom. My biggest mistake about sci-fi fandom is I wanted to give back to the community and get into convention running instead of just being an attendee and a guest. And, you get in too far and the mind worms start and people start spreading rumors about you. Live and learn. Again, it wasn't the entire community. It was a set of gatekeepers. And that is our reality right now. What we need to do is start forming alternative groups. Like, I'm not a big believer in community as a replacement for a really good core support network. Those 2 to 4 friends, 2 to 3 friends you have that you can really count on to really have your back when you're having a bad day. You can admit weakness to, you can admit mistakes to, and they don't reject you. They support you even when they don't agree with you. A community can't replace that. The problem is those are hard to find if you don't have a community. And what I am trying to do with this channel is turn sort of the comment section into a community by proxy using Feedback Friday. So at least people feel a little bit validated. I have not been able to find the secret sauce that moves that into more of, tried Zoom parties, things like that. They were unmitigated disasters. But I'm still trying. I'm trying to find something I can do to give people the opportunity. But, you know, this is a commenter who has commented quite a few times before. I've read their comments. I recognize their screen name, and people respond to the comments and try to see that as its own form of fledgling community. We will be doing a Discord for the video game. More on video game stuff next week on the Boss Fight Song of Sparkle Muffin game. So that is an alternative. But because of this internet stuff, obviously there will be very, very, very big rules based on behaviors, not opinions. And we have to get those locked in before we can move forward on that. That is something I'm working on right now. But I'm trying to be the change we want to see here. I'm trying to at least make this little part of the internet not suck. And judge people by how they conduct themselves, not necessarily the views they walk in the proverbial room with. Hopefully that helps some, because we're all we only have so much control over what corporations do, over what governments do. But we are not our governments. We are not corporations. We are people. And I firmly believe, even though it's hard, that if you don't stand up for your principles, you never meet people who share them. And that's scary in the short term, and you do deal with a lot of rejection. You might even get kicked off Twitter or Facebook. But, you know, if you're willing to see another person's point of view, if you're willing to even change your mind, or you're willing to adapt how you communicate your perspective so that you can be heard and not rejected outright, you know, there's hope. And that's all I can leave with right now, because that's all I got. So hopefully that's enough. Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching.